Okay, the California Gold Rush. Why is the California Gold Rush such a landmark period in American history? The historian Edward Dolnick provides a succinct answer. The Gold Rush story is set in America, and it is, in many respects, the American story. Many of the great themes play out on center stage. The journey west in search of a better life, the collision between races and nationalities, the ingrained faith that tomorrow will vastly outshine today, the focus on material success, the omnipresent, taken for granted violence, the proud belief that America is the land of the self-made man who rises by virtue of luck and pluck rather than blood or birth. In the sense that California is like the rest of America, only more so, the Gold Rush is the American story, only more so. What was the temper of the times before the explosive revelation of the existence of California gold? And why and how did it make such an extraordinary impact in the lives of such a huge number of people? And what did the Mexican-American War have to do with any of this? And what about the admittance of the state of California to the Union? And how did the spirit of the gold rush continue to have such an influence throughout successive decades? We may or may not be able to answer some of these questions. Daily life for most Americans in the mid-19th century, despite the societal effects of the Industrial Revolution, were not terribly different from life as it had been for centuries. Two laws governed the world. The path to success was long and difficult, and the race was not to the swift, but to the diligent. A penny saved is a penny earned. And second, calamity could come in many ways and totally without warning. Jobs and savings could vanish overnight, and disease and disaster were always a looming threat. For example, during the Panic of 1837, nearly half of the country's banks failed. Meat and flour doubled in price, and in the eastern cities, 1 man in 3 was unemployed. Diseases were rampant, and contagions such as tetanus, pneumonia, and especially cholera decimated large swaths of the population. A cholera epidemic of the 1830s continued to gain strength throughout the 1840s. It was into these conditions of struggle and hardship that the news of the discovery of gold in California exploded. Many of us will be familiar with the story of the discovery of gold by James Marshall, although this fact is still a bit controversial, a New Jersey native who had traveled to California in 1844. He was one of the hundreds of men working at Sutter's Fort. John Sutter, for his part, had also emigrated, first to the United States and then to California, leaving a wife and 5 children and debt collectors behind in Germany. Sutter's Fort was a 50,000-acre property that Sutter had received permission from the Mexican government to establish a settlement. It was ideally located at the junction of the American and Sacramento rivers. Another paper could be written about Sutter, whose behavior, especially killing and impressing hundreds of indigenous people into slavery, shocked even many of his white contemporaries. It is notable to remark, with a feeling of deserved justice, that the forthcoming gold rush ruined his fortunes. In 1847, Sutter made plans to expand his empire with the building of a sawmill along the American River. James Marshall was directed to find a suitable spot. The place he chose was 45 miles up the South Fork of the American River. On January 24, 1848, during the construction of the sawmill, Marshall was examining a newly constructed tail race being built to divert the river and noticed glittering flakes in the riverbed. After a few days, he decided to gather up his discoveries to share with the so-called Captain Sutter. We need to divert from the events of January 24th, 1847, for a few minutes to remark that this discovery was only 9 days prior to the cessation of the Mexican-American War. Prior to 1846, California was the territory of Mexico. A Mexican landowning class known as the Californios owned vast ranches throughout the territory. Upon the conclusion of the war, the United States paid Mexico $15 million and gained over 1 million square miles of land in the area that would become the states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, and California. Events moved at an extremely rapid pace, and within 2 years, California was admitted to the Union as a free state. Another paper could be written on this development and the impact that a large non-slave holding state would subsequently have as the nation descended into civil war. But to return to the events of early 1848. After traveling back to Sutter's Fort, Marshall excitedly showed Sutter his gold flakes and small nuggets. Sutter, whose rights to the land where the sawmill was located was tenuous, asked Marshall to keep the discovery a secret that did not last very long. An article in the Californian, a San Francisco newspaper, read, "Gold mine found in the newly made raceway of the sawmill recently erected by Captain Sutter on the American Fork. Gold has been found in considerable quantities. There are great chances here for scientific capitalists. Gold has been found in almost every part of the country." But many people assumed that this was a hoax, and it gained very little notice until Samuel Brannan, the publisher of this newspaper, the Californian, decided to promote the story. He returned to San Francisco after a visit to the Sacramento Valley with a small bottle full of gold that he waved in the air, shouting, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." The population of San Francisco at this time numbered about 800 people, so it did not take long for this to create a sensation, and it did. The town was nearly deserted as men rushed to what came to be known as the gold fields. And for these early miners, the results were often spectacular. With small effort, men were finding hundreds of dollars worth of gold in a time when a laborer might earn $1 for a day's work. Samuel Brannan, very much the entrepreneur, realized that a fortune could be made, but not in the gold fields, but by supplying the necessities that newcomers would need for mining. He published an extra 2,000 copies of his newspaper, promoting the riches of California, and sent them off by pack mule on a 4-month trip to Missouri. Soon, however, the news reached beyond California and Missouri to the entire nation and the world. In July, the military governor of California prepared an official report in which he estimated that there were already 4,000 miners in the area. Along with this report to Washington, D.C., was sent 230 ounces of gold. Then, on December 5, 1848, the State of the Union address by President Polk included this sentence: "The accounts of the abundance of gold in that territory are of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service who have visited the mineral district and derived the facts which they detail from personal observation." The discovery was now official. The rush was on. All along the eastern states, gold fever infected thousands of people. Across the world, others were also preparing to go to California. From Chile, Mexico, China, and Europe, men were mortgaging homes and borrowing from family to finance claims of mining land. The 49ers, as they came to be known, was the year that the gold rush was at its peak. Sometimes this frenzy took on an almost mythic stature, with allusions to the Argonauts, the explorers of Greek mythology who searched for the Golden Fleece. A popular poem of the time read, "Like Argos of ancient times, I'll leave this modern Greece. I'm bound to California mines to find the Golden Fleece. For who would work from morn to night and live on hog and corn when one can pick up there at sight enough to buy a farm?" There were many sermons preaching against the folly of these modern-day Argonauts. Reverend Cleveland of Connecticut, in this fire and brimstone sermon in early 1849, warned gold seekers to worry about the danger to their health, life, and character. He warned, quote, "The filth and scum of society have gathered and poured in there to seethe and ferment into one putrid mass of unmitigated depravity." Close quote.
We're still there.
However, there were many infected with the gold fever who declined to heed his advice. Travelers from the eastern states journeyed 3 ways, all of them very arduous. One, of course, was overland by wagon, second by ship from the eastern seaboard, stopping at Panama and including a formidable trek across the isthmus and boarding another trip, or third by traveling by ship all the way around Cape Horn. Whichever route was chosen was a several months long journey and presented an enormous array of challenges and dangers. I'd like to digress for a few minutes and bring in 2 Sewickley connections to the gold rush. In 1905, the Sewickley Herald presented a series of articles taken from the diary of Mr. Joshua S. Piers. Although originally from Illinois, he was then living with his daughter, Mrs. W.G. Phelps, on Hill Street, and was able to reminisce about his time as a 49er. Each week for almost a year, the Herald published an article taken from Mr. Piers' journal that recounted his journey west. Unfortunately, after months of published entries, Mr. Piers passed away, and the Herald ceased publishing his journal entries. They said they did this out of respect to him. But it left off as his group was almost California. How he fared there, I've not learned. I would hope that Mr. Piers was rewarded at the goldfields after his laborious journey. His accounts, and his was one of many such accounts by 49ers, are fascinating and tedious at the same time. He first writes about their preparations for the trip. And this he wrote directly for the Herald, and it wasn't part of his journey, but it was like an introduction to his journal articles. In the fall of 1848, I fell victim to the gold fever and determined to form a little band of 6 and prepare during the winter for an early start the following spring, and succeeded in getting together a company consisting of George Blood, Samuel G. Clark, a farmer, Daniel Burdett, blacksmith and wagon maker, Dr. Richardson, and Henry Hall, an attorney, and myself. We decided to lay in a food supply ample for 1 year, also 2 wagons and 4 yoke of oxen for each wagon. Mr. Burdett built the 2 wagons especially for the journey, and during the winter we scoured the country for the oxen and gathered up our food supply. Our entire outfit cost us in the neighborhood of $1,200. Only a 49er can appreciate the annoyances, troubles, conflicts of opinions, delays, and worries of a little company of 6 who are preparing to enter the immense and then comparatively unknown and unsettled region of plains, mountains, and deserts lying between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. Later articles recount that Henry Hall died from cholera only 2 weeks into the trip. The small group continued to join up with other companies along the way, and at one point he writes that as far as the eye could see were wagons headed to the gold fields. Mr. Piers relates repeated arguments about wagons being overweight and the condition of the oxen, encounters with Indians, meetings with other would-be miners who had given up and were returning home, and the many graves that were marked along the trail. At the end of each day, he makes note of the miles traveled. By the end of 4 months, they had progressed approximately 1,550 miles from the Missouri River. It was about this time that he remarked, and you can read between the lines, that upon arrival in the goldfields, their group would disband and it would be every man for himself. His passing in December 1905 was noted with a front page headline in the Herald, which noted that he had been in delicate health ever since his hazardous crossing of the continent during the gold excitement of 1849. The obituary goes on to say, Mr. Piers was a man of many lovable traits, and his sunny disposition won for him a host of friends in the valley who mourn with the bereaved family at his sudden demise. I also discovered a 49er who was a native of Sewickley, Mr. John C. Anderson. He's included in that notable volume, The Village of Sewickley by Franklin Nevin. Quote, no citizen of our valley was better known or more honored than Captain John C. Anderson, whose 100th birthday was celebrated as a community event on January 14, 1928. The Sewickley Herald issue of January 3, 1925, when Mr. Anderson was then 97 years of age and living on Centennial Avenue, relates the story of his quest for gold. Although not written in the first person, as was Mr. Piers, I found his story very interesting. Here then is a brief account of Mr. Anderson, 21 years of age, and his adventures as a 49er. On the last day of 1848, the Pittsburgh, California Enterprising Company, 300 members strong, traveled down the Ohio River as far as St. Joseph, Missouri, and then spent several weeks purchasing wagons and supplies. However, the company quickly lost many members. As Mr. Anderson relates, get a lot of men out in the wilderness and they do not get along very well. On May 1st, those remaining in the company set out for hundreds of miles through what was then Indian country. Passing peacefully through the area of many tribes, they had one terrifying encounter with Sioux warriors who were embroiled in a feud with the Pawnees. The Herald report continues Mr. Anderson's story. This happened when they were slowly dragging their way through the Platte River country. Far ahead of them, they saw a great cloud of dust and thought they were surprising a great herd of buffalo, and were glad to feel the firearms so thoughtfully presented to them for protection on their departure from Fort Leavenworth several days before. Here, just ahead, they felt assured of some good fresh meat for dinner. But what was their consternation to discover? That it was not buffalo, but what looked like thousands of Indians in full war paint and feather regalia rushing toward them. Captain Joe Taylor, who then had charge of the train, ordered them to form a circle with the wagons, as we have all seen in famous motion pictures. It was just in time, for they charged down on them with a wild war whoop. And according to Mr. Anderson, there is nothing more terrifying. But as suddenly as they had come, they turned their horses violently about and raced for the horizon. After 4 arduous months, they arrived in the gold fields with, as the article relates, each to seek his own fortune in the land of their heart's desire. Mr. Anderson did a 6 weeks turn at placer mining with moderate success, earning on one red letter day $136. But finding the exposure injurious to his health, he traveled to Sacramento, and with a newly purchased wagon and team, he set up a profitable business hauling goods from the supply boats. Later, he bought a ranch in the Indian country south of Sacramento and established a thriving business reselling mules and horses to newly arriving miners. The Herald report continues. In the summer of 1851, he sold out his 160 acres and started for home, out through the Golden Gate and on to Panama. He traveled 3,300 miles down the Pacific, and crossing the isthmus with some natives in a huge canoe, he came up the Atlantic coast 2,500 miles to New York, where he had his first glimpse of a locomotive. He came as far as Johnstown by rail, and then took a stage the rest of the way to Pittsburgh. Once back in Sewickley, he was able to realize his boyhood dream of becoming a river captain. And for 25 years, he was a riverboat pilot on the Ohio, and notably ferried men and supplies during the Civil War. I enjoyed reading Mr. Pure's recollections and the story from Mr. Anderson, but they are both minor players in the enormous number of mostly men who were afflicted with gold fever. Estimated figures of those who traveled the trails west suggest that there were more than 32,000 in 1849, more than 44,000 in 1850, and more than 50,000 in 1851. The early mining towns that sprang up were raucous, violent, and almost exclusively male. One miner wrote about a typical Sunday. The principal street in Coloma was alive with crowds of moving men, passing and repassing, laughing, talking, all appearing in the best of humor. It was a scene that no other country could ever imitate. Antipodes of color, race, religion, language, government, conditions, size, capability, strength, and morals were there within that small village in the mountains of California. Unfortunately, by the end of 1849, the easy search for placer gold, the gold that has washed up to the surface, was over. Many disappointed miners were forced to return home, but others, much like a down-on-his-luck gambler, kept hoping day after strenuous day for a lucky strike. As the relatively easy pickings began to vanish, mining companies offered employment to men who went further underground to find seams of gold. So they were no longer independent miners. They were now contracted with a company. The gold rush continued to draw in thousands from Mexico, Hawaii, South America, Europe, Australia, and China. And as gold prospecting yielded fewer or no returns, the violence between and against anyone considered a non-American grew. The Mexicans, who only a few years earlier were citizens of this territory, were now seen as a foreign threat and were treated with disdain and injustice. Nighttime raids, murders, and lynchings were not uncommon. The injustices to Native Americans were horrendous, and Chinese immigrants also suffered and were specifically singled out with targeted taxation. Statistics are sometimes rather dry, but not in the case of the record of phenomenal growth of California as the world continued to rush in. In 1847, just prior to the end of the Mexican-American War, California's entire population was approximately 13,000 people. 7,000 were native-born Mexicans and about 6,000 foreigners, most of whom were Americans. By 1852, 5 years later, California's population had swelled to 260,000. San Francisco, which in 1848 had about 800 residents, grew to 30,000 in 3 years. As noted in one historical account, although San Francisco claimed to be the great metropolis of the Pacific Coast, it was in actuality a brawling city of tents and shacks occupied by derelict sailors, gamblers, and prostitutes. A survey of the area in 1853 revealed 537 liquor stores, 46 gambling houses, and 48 houses of prostitution. As the city lacked adequate sanitation, tuberculosis and dysentery were common, and the streets were often knee-deep in mud and manure. "This is not a town, it's a quagmire," complained one Frenchman. Fires ripped through the city on a regular basis. In 1 year alone, the center of San Francisco burned down 3 times. With the influx of miner gold, it was rebuilt each time, finer, grander, and larger. The gold rush led to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and jump-started businesses that provided for a more robust national economy. The Transcontinental Railroad spurred the expansion of other industries such as steel, stone, and lumber. In 1882, for example, the railroads purchased nearly 90% of all steel produced in the United States. Other business forms by such men as Levi Strauss or Hungarian immigrant Augustin Arasi, who planted dozens of varieties of grapes to start a wine business, are only two examples of the burgeoning economy. The transformation in the lives of innumerable men and women is worth noting. The gold rush was instrumental in transforming the American dream from the ideals of the Puritan ethic of diligent work and thrift into one that was suited to an emerging entrepreneurial culture. One miner's philosophical musing is an apt summation of this new view of the world. One man works hard all his life and ends up a pauper. Another man, no smarter, makes $20 million. Luck has a hell of a lot to do with it. Those who returned to their former lives in the East were forever changed by their experiences. I happened upon a remarkable book entitled One Man's Gold, The Letters and Journal of a 49er. Published in 1930, it was compiled from the journal and letters of Enos Christman from Westchester, Pennsylvania. His journal and the loving letters to and from his intended bride, Ellen Apple, were found some 75 years after the gold rush in a tin box in a closet of an old Pennsylvania farmhouse. Mr. Christman's writings cover the 3 years that he journeyed to and from the gold fields. From his prospecting work in California, he had been able to send 93 ounces of gold to the mint in Philadelphia. And according to my calculations, and hopefully they're correct, that would be about $66,000 in 2020 dollars. And he also had enough to buy himself a watch for $34 and pay for the expenses for his journey home. His letters to and from Ellen Apple are very loving and heartfelt, and he often references his good friend Clint Atkins. I would like to conclude today with the beautifully written final entry in his journal that was composed after he had returned from home to Pennsylvania. I've contemplated too about the multi-layered interpretation of the word fortune that is in his final sentence, in this final sentence of this entry. May 9, 1853. Wife Ellen and I were in Philadelphia yesterday to see the ship Europe, which is lying at Pine Street Wharf, ready for another voyage to California. The old craft does not look much the worse of the wear, notwithstanding the manner in which she is buffeted about by the winds when she plows through the heavy season on the passage around Cape Horn. When we came within sight of her, I almost felt as though I were being greeted by an old and tried friend. Memory carried me back to the day that I turned my face towards a land of golden promise, and I thought again of the high hopes with which I then set sail, and the melancholy reflections upon all I was leaving behind. As we were borne out of sight of home, many of us gazed at the familiar hills and vales, feeling that perhaps we might never look upon them again. What trying times were those that followed for Clint Atkins and myself. It is a true saying that health is the greatest of blessings. How easy it was for Clint to walk into trouble. He saw more hardships in 3 years than in his whole life before, and he breathed his last in his lonely cabin in that far-off land. But the thought of the dear burden on my arm broke in upon these musings and reminded me that all was well with me. Indeed, my hopes have been gratified, and I have realized a fortune. After you read about the love between the two of them, between Enos and his bride, Ellen, when he says, he says about the deer burden on his arm, his wife, and that he had realized a fortune. He had realized a fortune, but I think he also meant that his current happy state was also part of his fortune, or maybe a more significant part of his fortune. Okay, I did some calculations if anyone is interested, just as a little epilogue here. 1 ounce of gold in 1849 was equal $20.67. And I did some more, hopefully, correct calculations. 1 ounce of gold in today's market, 2022, just here in February, is $1,900, rounded off. So, and $100 in 1849 is the equivalent of $3,359 in 2020. So, that means, it just means that we've had a lot of inflation. I don't know what else it means, but it was significant when you work for $1 a day as a laborer, and then you can scoop up hundreds of dollars. Especially those beginning miners were able to do that. So it was.
I'm curious about the logistics of him sending gold to Philadelphia.
I know.
And it was worth $60-some thousand.
Yeah, they did.
And then
I think it was like through a bank. It wasn't like
he
just
just
put this
put
in
it
a
in a box
and send it off. No, there was an actual. I guess I'm not sure how the transfer.
Somehow it had to be secured because
it was secured,
they could, we never got it, or
right, yeah.
It could be.
I have the book downstairs.
Intercepted.
I should have brought it up, but there is a place where he said he took it to, and I think it was some type of bank or something that he was able to actually. And then I don't think he actually carried that money home with him. I think it was maybe on deposit in Westchester.
And he drew some money for his expenses.
His
You said
expenses,
they covered
yeah.
for the watch and for his expenses.
Expenses, yeah. He itemized the clothing.
I'm just curious how things operate
right.
prior to today.
Yeah,
how
he
things
couldn't just
operate.
wire it over.
Yeah.